Thanks for attending today. We are Prism Services, a part of Vancouver Coastal Health, and today we're going to be doing part one of our Intro to Transgender Cultural Safety workshop. I'd just like to do a brief land acknowledgement where Parker and myself are zooming in from is on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. It's directly important to speak about this when we are talking about gender, because a lot of our ideas about gender, especially within our work in health and in the greater experience, have directly been affected by colonization, and every culture in Canada have their own cultural practices and discussions and spiritual practices about gender that were completely erased and eradicated or minimized by colonization. So it's directly involved within our work. It's directly involved within your work, especially in the context of gender and sexuality, but expanding out to many other things that we might touch within this presentation. But with that being said, we're just going to introduce ourselves briefly. So Parker and I are both from Prism Services, which is a information and referral program that specifically focuses on 2S LGBTQIA+ health and wellness, directly for VCH staff and physicians and volunteers, as well as people living within Vancouver Coastal Health catchment. We provide folks with resources in the community, and we do trainings on site for healthcare staff, but we also do external workshops like these to reach out and provide this education in more context-specific situations outside of healthcare. My name is Charlie Hines. I am an administrative assistant with the Transspecialty Care Program and an educator with Prism. I use they, she pronouns. I identify as non-binary, and I am a white settler here. I live in Vancouver. It's been about 4 years since I started living here, and I've been doing this work for about 3 years now. Parker, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name's Parker. My pronouns are they, them. I work with Charlie at Prism Services. A little bit about myself. Also an uninvited white settler, identify as non-binary and queer. I just moved into healthcare about 3 years ago. Before that, I worked for the Vancouver School Board for over a decade. I'm not sure how long. So do have some familiarity with education. I think that it's really important to have gender diverse people leading this work. And that being said, myself and Charlie, we have our own specific experiences, and a lot of privilege in certain areas of our identities. So, as we go through this, it's keeping in mind that it's through our own lens that we've created this content, and that we will answer questions to the best of our ability, but we don't speak on behalf of the trans community. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Parker. So with that being said, let's move into the material. Why exactly does gender diversity matter? So one of the things about many of the misconceptions that are going around is that gender diversity is sort of this new idea that's being propagated by the quote unquote liberal agenda. But gender diversity has always existed within many different cultures, even outside of North America. Many different traditions were passed around the idea of 3 genders or multiple genders within a system of different societies within the world that have been since erased by colonization and exposure to sort of more Western traditionalist values, which have reinforced a cis heteronormative value structure and gender expression and non-reproductive sexual orientations. So anything outside of that has been suppressed. And it's created sort of this idea of what is considered cis heteronormativity. So this is just a compulsory assumption that heterosexuality and cisgender identities are normal, ideal, and superior. And within healthcare, obviously, this is relevant to our work with the discussions that go around whether trans care should be considered an elective service or if it's considered life-saving healthcare. The conversation does also arise within school settings as well, within community settings, and it's specifically these ideas are being proposed to dismantle a lot of the more cis heteronormative programming and policies that really only keep these identities in mind. And this work is really important to create that space which is more safe and inclusive, to dismantle our ideas of what is important in education and strive towards that sense of equity, that everyone has access to the resources that they need based on their own lived experience. A lot of questions as well is it okay for me to be skeptical? I personally think it's natural for us to be concerned about our relatives, our students, our colleagues, our patients, our clients, and to have questions about how these specific services and new ideas that are coming out of uh, a more grassroots ideas about gender. And it's natural to, especially when we've lived a certain way, to feel certain ways about these things. But it is important to keep in mind that we do hold biases that exist in a space where, gender affirming care or not having your gender recognized is not part of your identity. It's not part of your specific healthcare goals. And because of this, it's important that we keep an open mind and that we, talk about what is necessary for some folks and then not necessary for others, to come to more of a baseline. So throughout this workshop, we are going to discuss many ideas about privilege and how we can be affected by the constant stream of information and misinformation that we're experiencing by having everything be on the internet now. And then we're going to hopefully keep space for new ideas as we go through the presentation and when you speak to clients and students. So we're going to start off with some key terms and concepts. I'm going to pass it over to Parker to go through these. So Parker, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. So when we talk about 2S LGBTQIA plus people and identities, those terms can get really mixed up, especially when this is new for some folks. I like to begin by parsing out different components in that. So there's one term related to physical sex. So when we're talking about physical sex, we're talking about someone's physical body, not only, what reproductives they were born with, also their chromosomes, hormones, and related medical care. And in this context, what I mean by related medical care is care around someone's, gender identity. So that might be hormone replacement therapy or surgeries. So physical sex, about the body. Gender identity is our internal felt sense of who we are as a man, a woman, non-binary person, gender fluid, etc. So this is a subjective thing. It's someone's personal truth about their identity. And how they show that to the world is how they wear their gender. Some people say is their gender expression. So things like clothing, hairstyle, pronouns, other factors. So you might hear words to describe that like feminine, masculine, androgynous, and other words. So gender identity, again, is about ourselves. Sexual orientation, of course, is how we feel about other people, who we are romantically, emotionally, sexually attracted to, whether that's, one particular gender, multiple genders, or some folks don't experience sexual attraction or romantic attraction to others, or don't experience it very strongly. And that's what the A is on the end of the acronym for asexual. As Charlie said in our introduction, for a lot of us, the way that we learned about gender, about sexuality, about physical sex is really within a colonial framework, and within binaries. So you're either one thing or another. There's only two options. So, there's starting to be various people kind of moving outside of that and looking at things first as a spectrum, and then, even going outside of that to look at things, more broadly and with more complexity. We are very complex creatures, and, two options don't usually cut it for us. So the acronym. Okay, so this acronym changes. It's changed for Vancouver Coastal Health in the past 3 years. It's going to continue to change and develop as language emerges to include people who've been, pushed to the margins in our society. I was thinking about this a lot this week, about how quickly language is developing and evolving. And I know for a lot of people that can be a bit obnoxious because you're like, I just learned the other acronym and now they changed it again. But for people who are queer, lesbian, gay, trans, non-binary, a lot of us have grown up in this way where words just never fit us and felt right for us. And then one day, for many of us, myself included, having this like aha moment where you don't suddenly feel like othered and like a weirdo. You just found this identity that fits who you are. So I think it's really important that it keeps changing. It also needs to be culturally reflexive. So, the change that happened within VCH was the 2S moved from the end of the acronym to the beginning, and 2S is an Indigenous specific term. So someone somewhere, probably on the internet, thought, why do we have this Indigenous cultural term, tacked on at the end when we all live on Indigenous land and we need to be, centering Indigenous people in these conversations. So it was moved to the front. Anyway, that's my long spiel. We'll go over some of these terms. I think we're gonna touch on two-spirit, transgender, queer, intersex. So two-spirit, as I said before, this is a term for Indigenous people to self-identify with. The best way to learn about two-spirit identities, two-spirit culture, two-spirit history is from two-spirit people and Indigenous people. I am not Indigenous and neither is Charlie, but there's this wonderful course on the Learning Hub. It's also on the Transcare BC site. Anyone can take it. It's open to the public. It's self-directed, interactive, and it is a wonderful way to learn from two-spirit and Indigenous transgender people more about this term. For the sake of today, I'll give my best description. So two-spirit is an Indigenous language term that's an umbrella term to reflect complex understandings of gender and sexuality that can often be tied to culture and spirituality for Indigenous folks. Within different Indigenous communities, there's lots of terminology and language to describe genders outside of being a man or a woman, or to describe sexual orientations or ways that people love or have family. So this term was coined in 1990 to kind of bridge this Indigenous understanding with an English term. So it includes lots of people, transgender folks, queer folks, and is often tied to cultural roles as well. So some gender identity terms. So gender identity, again, who we know ourselves to be as a woman, man, non-binary person, two-spirit, gender fluid, etc. Most people are cisgender. So you might also hear this as cis. This is a neutral descriptive term that just describes a really common gender identity. So it describes someone who is assigned female at birth and identifies as a woman, or who's assigned male at birth and identifies as a man. This is a really important term to use when, if you're talking about gender and you self-identify that way. And it's really important because previously to this becoming a more commonly used word, people would say things like, oh, I'm a biological man, or I'm a real man, or, I'm a regular woman, I'm not trans, or I'm just normal, or like, I am what I look like. Why are you asking me that? Those ways of describing like cisgender experiences tend to really have negative connotations for trans people. So you having a similar term or a similar neutral term to describe one's gender is a good thing. It's not a slur. It's not insulting. It's a great word to use. My mom uses it all the time. So we've been talking about trans all for, a good 10 minutes. What does that mean? Another umbrella term. So trans just describes someone, simplest way to think about it, is someone who doesn't identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So someone who's assigned female at birth and is a man or non-binary or two-spirit and doesn't feel like a woman, or someone who's assigned male at birth and is a woman, non-binary, two-spirit, gender fluid, agender, etc. So people who, that initial like M or F on their birth certificate doesn't fit who they are. There are lots of identities within, being transgender. And if we had more time today, we could go over all of them, but I will just talk about one more, which is non-binary. This term, again, is becoming more widely used. And the simplest definition is someone who doesn't identify as a man or a woman, or exclusively as a man or a woman. So some people might feel like, a blend of masculine and feminine, or if gender is a spectrum right in the middle or outside of those ideas altogether. There's lots of ways that this can be embodied and look and feel for folks. Gender diverse, I would include non-binary and trans people in that. It's folks whose gender identities, roles, gender expressions don't match social or cultural expectations. So yeah, people who kind of fall outside of the binary or have a gender expression that's very different than what's typically expected based on their sex assigned at birth. At the bottom there, you'll see some terms to avoid. So transsexual is an older term. It's a bit outdated. Some people still use this to self-identify and find this term empowering, but we want to be really cautious when we're using it for other people. You can always just use trans. It's kind of the short form, or transgender is the more widely welcomed term. Really want to avoid transvestite, hermaphrodite. These are, older Jerry Springer, like shock value terms that people don't usually like to be used to describe them. And then the last one, like lifestyle choice, describing someone's gender identity or sexual orientation as like a lifestyle choice can be fairly dismissive. Lifestyle choice might be like, I like to ski, I'm outdoorsy, or I'm really into my cat. Gender identity and sexual orientation are a core part of who people are. Going on with the terms. So sometimes there's two Q's in the acronym just to keep people on their toes. One of them is queer, and I'm sure people have heard this term all over the place: the Queer Film Festival, Queer Arts Festival, Queer Community, Queer Cultural Center. So this is a really broad term that's vague on purpose, and it's to include anyone within the whole like 2S LGBTQIA+ acronym who wants to be included in that. Some folks don't like this term to be used for them. A lot of older people who might have, come of age when it was illegal to be gay and seen as a mental illness, and the word queer was used as a slur and in a really aggressive and negative way. They might not be feeling great about that term. It's a word we say has been reclaimed. So, in the 80s, late 80s, the community on, I believe literally had like a meeting and took this term and decided to make it something positive and to take ownership of it. Also, I know a lot of transgender people who are identify as straight or heterosexual and who don't use the term queer to describe themselves. Because, within community, queer can also usually more so be referred to in terms of sexual orientation. So with any of these terms, we just want to be thoughtful when we're using them for an individual, that's how they self-identify. And then, of course, questioning someone who's in the process of figuring out their sexual orientation or gender identity. Earlier, I talked about terms within the acronym that have to do with physical sex. So the I in 2SL LGBTQIA+ stands for intersex. Some people who have a difference in sex development will identify as intersex. Some don't. Difference in sex development is describes a variety of conditions where someone has a biological trait that occurs naturally, where something about them or multiple things exists like outside of the medical range for like male or female, or something doesn't match up in the way that the medical system has been set out to match up, that they can have that M or that F. This can be something that people know right at birth. Some people who have anatomical variations might know this, as a kiddo is born. Some people might learn this during puberty or trying to conceive a child. There's lots of ways that people have a difference in sex development. And it's a lot of people. It's up to and over 2% of the population, if you use a more broad definition and criteria for this term, but it's not something that we talk about very much. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks very much. We've sort of covered a lot of the broader terminology, but I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what gender affirming healthcare is available in BC. Every province in Canada has different standards and practices, but they all fall under what is considered the WPATH guidelines, or the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. But not every province offers the services laterally. Some provinces have a much more streamlined way to access these surgeries, and some require a lot longer to access and have less practitioners that are offering the surgery, or offering gender affirming care. So in British Columbia, we currently provide MSP coverage for surgeries such as vaginoplasty, vulvoplasty, phalloplasty, metoidioplasty, orchiectomy, erectile tissue release, hysterectomy, masculinizing top surgery, and breast augmentation, as long as it's approved through MSP. So there are some gender affirming surgeries that are not covered. At the bottom, you'll see things like laser hair removal, electrolysis, facial feminization surgery, or facial masculinization surgery, and tracheal shaving or removal of the Adam's apple are not currently covered in BC. And people who wish to access those procedures have to private pay. So it can be a pretty class-based access to these services, as they're prohibitively expensive and not everyone has the means to be able to access them. Now, however, something like hormone replacement therapy can be accessed through many gender-affirming care providers across the province. That being said, even within Vancouver, there's only one clinic that offers it as a specialty service, and it's dependent on family doctors outside of Vancouver Coastal Health to be able to prescribe it themselves or refer to a specialist. Again, it's not nearly enough to serve the growing trans population. We're facing a huge doctor shortage for almost everything, and this is definitely included with that. So there's many different ways that people might access gender affirming care, and it's not all medical. I think a lot of the mysticism and sort of mystique of transitioning is that it is specifically just changing your name and going and getting on hormones and getting surgery, and then you're done. But it's a lot more complicated than that. People have different gender goals. People have different things they want to access. People want to be who they feel they are, and there's many different ways to accomplish that. So with that, there's different ways that people can do this. There's coming out socially. So this is like coming out to your family and your friends, or to people at work, changing your name and your pronouns, going to different social groups or support groups for this when you're trying to like figure things out at the beginning. Then there's hormone therapy. There's different things that are prescribed for this depending on whether you want to feminize or masculinize your body. And by doing this, you take either estrogen therapy or testosterone therapy. But there's also things like puberty blockers or hormone blockers, which are used on adults as well to suppress testosterone or to give specific desired effects. There's also other drugs like finasteride, which is to prevent male pattern baldness that can occur when taking testosterone. Because as men age or have an excess amount of testosterone in their body, they begin to bald. That's just an unfortunate part of having testosterone. But luckily, there are things we can take to combat this. And a lot of it's also prescribed for people who are experiencing alopecia as a countermeasure for that as well. So the other things people can do is there's, buying new clothing or changing their silhouette with pads or binding or tucking, and then getting, different haircuts, wearing makeup, growing your hair out or shaving your hair, getting laser hair removal or electrolysis. And then, of course, we talked about the surgical route. And there's administrative things you can do too. You can go get your ID changed, you can go get your name changed, you can go get your sex marker on your ID changed. All these things, come at the discretion of the person who's accessing them. They may not want all of these things, or they may want as much as is provided. Again, these things are also not linear. Some people transition completely from one way to the other, and that's the end of the story. And some people, move down one way and then decide that process isn't for them, and then they figure something else out. So, but as a policy of respect, it's not possible for us to know someone's gender identity or sexual orientation just by looking at them. So it's important to avoid assumptions. Gender identity is different from sexual orientation, and transgender people can be queer, straight, gay, bi, etc. It's really dependent on the person. And because of this, we don't need to know everything or anything about someone's gender or sexuality to treat them respectfully. There's, we just need to see them as they are and employ that policy of respect. And the other thing is gender diversity is, again, very cultural based. It's not just within North America. Many different cultures around the world have their own ideas about gender that are enforced through spirituality or culturally. It would take me literally like a university level course to go into real detail about this, but I did put some on the side here of different cultures that are in different regions of the world. If you go on pbs.org, there is a Two-Spirit and International Gender Diversity map that you can access and read up about the different cultures if you're ever interested. But yeah, over here, there's just a couple. This is a very small vertical slice, but definitely really interesting to look into if you have the time. Next piece is youth. As of today, we actually have some new news about youth healthcare in the United States. This has been an ongoing conversation. Unfortunately, Ohio has made the decision, even though there was a veto from their governor, to ban gender-affirming care for anyone under the age of 18. So even today, we are seeing huge effects on transgender youth that we have not been seeing prior to this. A lot of this has started because there is a huge amount of misinformation on children and youth accessing gender-affirming care. The biggest one being around hormone blockers. So hormone blockers have been used for over 30 years for children who enter puberty too early, or for what is called precocious puberty. They're completely safe and reversible. And all they do is delay the onset of like the majority of the symptoms of puberty. So the voice deepening, specifically hair growth, acne, things like this. And these things are just delayed. They can't be used forever. Eventually, your body will just supersede them. But it's a challenging misconception and has been a humongous portion of the discourse around whether you should be able to access gender affirming care. And it's the same with hormone therapy. Hormone therapy is not being prescribed to 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds or 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 11-year-olds or 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds. It's usually prescribed like within, the range of people are like turning 14, 15, 16. And even then it starts in a low dose and then is, tailored for that person's body. So, and it's the same with gender affirming surgeries. In BC, you can't access lower surgery until you're 19. And when you're 19, you're legally an adult. As well as most other surgeries across the province, they've decided to make 19 the hard date, with the exception of masculinizing top surgery, which has a completely different workflow for youth accessing it, and it is much more complicated and takes a lot longer to access for people who are under the age of 19.
So one of the things that's really important to know, especially when engaging in media around trans youth and their access to gender affirming care, is that trans youth have very significant mental health disparities when compared to, the general population or cisgender youth. So you can see the stats on the side are pretty significant. This study from 2019 had almost 2/3 of trans youth in Canada seriously considering suicide within the past year, and over 1 in 5 attempting suicide. And vast majority of trans non-binary youth in the province having a chronic mental health condition. So those are very staggering numbers. But when we look at other factors, protective factors, and engagement in healthcare, these numbers fall significantly. So when youth are able to access gender affirming healthcare, these stats just start to plummet. And that's why if you're ever at a protest or a rally and you see someone holding a placard that says gender affirming care is life-saving care, because we have this research and this data, we know that it does save people's lives because it alleviates that mental distress. Some other protective factors is acceptance. Even having one person in a youth's life that validates who they are and accepts who they are and uses their name and their pronouns cuts that past year suicide attempt rate down by at least 1/3. So even just one person can make a huge difference. And we've seen in other stats, like when youth have a supportive family, a supportive school, mental health is much more resilient. And like suicidality again starts to plummet.
Thanks, Parker. So we're going to start to talk a bit and expand on some of the societal discrimination that gender diverse people experience. One of the biggest ways, and we touched on this throughout the presentation, but is the effects of colonization, specifically on gender and sexuality. One of the key tools of colonization was imposing these specific conservative values of not only gender, sexuality, but of white supremacy on the indigenous people. These norms were instilled by force and often resulted in the murder of Two-Spirit and other indigenous people. And this formed the basis for a lot of the homophobia, transphobia, racism, and other forms of discrimination that are still deeply embedded in our culture and our institutions to this day. So we have seen still just a gigantic resistance to change in a lot of different countries. I mean, there's still 65 different countries around the world that criminalize consensual same-sex sexual activities, and almost half of them were at one time or are still part of the British Commonwealth. Of course, that being said, the UK has some notoriously volatile relationship with the trans and gender diverse community. And we're looking at 12 countries that still have jurisdictions in which the death penalty is allowed for people who are practicing same-sex sexual activities. And then 14 countries still criminalize gender identity or expression of transgender people. Currently, there's only 19 countries that let people have X's on their ID when they're traveling. So even people who go and update their gender marker on their ID to an X on their passport are restricted to only traveling within the countries that will allow entry for people with that on their passport. So there's all sorts of there's this huge fallout from colonization that has affected pretty much every country in the world in respects to gender and sexuality and the criminalization of same-sex relationships. So a lot of times when we're talking about trans rights or the rights, gender diverse rights, or the rights, human rights of people, a lot of people conflate this idea that it should be the norm, and it should be, but it is in a lot of more administrative capacity. And there is a new movement that is coming out of this in a lot of the newer literature that I've read, written by trans advocates, of this idea of trans liberation. So what this means is, while countries may have rights for transgender people that are protected, judicial or administrative rights that allow people to affirm themselves, these are only in the context that their respective governments have deemed acceptable. This does not change the notion of the way that people will react and express hatred or disdain for gender diverse people in society. And a lot of these ideas are that gender diverse people need to be liberated from the stigma and oppression that is forced by the specific society that questions the very nature of what it means to have gender heterogeneity. So gender identity and expression are explicitly protected grounds in federal and provincial human rights codes in Canada. This is not the same as every other country in the world, as I said before, but a lot of this only happened recently with the passing of Bill C-16, pardon me, in 2017. But even then, we are still seeing a huge reaction to other policies that are passed in other countries like the United States and the UK, other countries in Europe, that are affecting the way that we talk about gender affirming care and sexuality and gender diversity. There was a study that was done in 2020 by Transpulse, and they spoke to I'm not sure if it has the number on this sheet, but it was, I believe, around 2,300 different gender diverse people about their experience. And 64% of these people reported that avoiding 3 or more public spaces for fear of being harassed or outed, and only 16% did not avoid any of the public spaces. Despite high levels of education, half of the respondents 25 or older still had a personal income of less than $30,000 a year. 40% of respondents were living in a low-income household. Most respondents rated their mental health as good, very good, or excellent, and 27% rated their health as fair or poor. 56% rated their mental health as fair or poor, and 1 in 3 had considered suicide in the past year. There had been 1 in 20 attempted suicides in the past year, and most had experienced either verbal harassment related to being trans or non-binary, or 16% had experienced physical assault, and 26% had experienced sexual assault. So these are staggeringly high numbers. and especially when it comes around income, because as we were talking about with like accessing gender affirming care, even though a lot of it is provided through MSP, there are certain things that you need from having an amount of class privilege or financial privilege to be able to access it. One of which being, if you want to go get a lower surgery from the gender surgery program or GRS Montreal, you have to have a residence to which you can be able to do your aftercare. And not everyone have this. There's lots of people who are homeless or living in an SRO where the conditions are not suitable for a recovery, and a lot of surgeons won't go through it because there's such a high rate of issues during that time when they're healing, that if they don't have the right conditions and it's not sanitary, or they don't have someone to take care of them, then the surgery won't be a success. And part of this survey as well was looking specifically at the intersection between racialized people and racialized gender diverse people and non-racialized gender diverse people, and how their experiences were in even just being stopped by police or security. So we see down here in the graph that, even just like there is a huge worry or people feeling neutral, but with racialized people, these stats are considerably higher. And even beyond that, there is a humongous increase in the amount of verbal harassment or physical or sexual assault within the last 5 years that were experienced by people who are racialized, trans, or non-binary respondents. And 45% of these people had been harassed at work, at school. That's a huge number. That's almost half. So these are like pretty huge numbers to keep in mind. So the next thing we're going to talk about is gender diversity and media. We're people who like to watch and read and play video games, and we absorb the information of the things that we experience, whether we are aware of it or not. We tend to have a certain bias based on our formative experiences of the things that we've, visually and we've either read or we've watched on TV. And this isn't just things that are fictional. These are, the news even has a huge effect based on the kind of news that we constantly absorb. So right now, I did manage to pull up a few trans characters and non-binary characters from different TV shows, just to show some that are some positive representations of trans characters in media. One of the more famous ones is Laverne Cox, who was a character on the show Orange is the New Black, who was a transgender actress and sort of became one of the, at least I remember, was one of the first transgender actresses to really make it big and play a trans character on a TV show that was handled at least fairly competently. But there's been characters since, like Hunter Schafer in Euphoria, and Naomi Parks in Sense8. But yeah, so there are some good representations. I'm not going to say every representation has been awful, but the proportion to it historically has not been great. One of the reasons for this is that with positive representation, for folks to accurately see their community represented in media through a truthful lens, we have to have that representation that accurately portrays it and isn't just relegated to stereotypes. And this is not just for people to see how they're represented. This is also to create positive role models. I mean, there's only a handful of trans and non-binary characters that I can think of that would be considered positive role models versus, the cis heteronormative experience where there are tons and tons of positive role models that we can see. And it's also important to show these characters thriving and surviving, to show that it's not all doom and gloom. It's not just people being harassed and murdered and having everything be doom and gloom, especially, when we are trying to present a sort of, universal lens as opposed to one very specific set of experiences, as a fear mongering to try and deter people from pursuing transitioning. So there is a large amount of problematic representation. I'm sure you have seen films where there are trans characters or gender diverse characters or non-binary characters that are handled quite poorly. So beyond underrepresentation, there is this tendency to have a relegation to stereotypes or tropes, which we would consider either the serial killer or the prostitute. These are two of the most common tropes we see for transgender characters in media. One of which, if you've ever seen the movie Silence of the Lambs, the main character, or one of the main villain, Buffalo Bill, is a trans woman who is denied access to gender affirming surgery because she is deemed mentally unfit for the surgery, and then begins to go and act out and attack people and do all sorts of horrible things. Again, this is a very common stereotype that a lot of trans women and trans men's reaction to being denied basic human rights and basic human healthcare needs is this idea of violence. And it's completely made to be that this is an absurd reaction and this is all there is. But on the opposite end, there's this idea of a relegation to victimhood or punishment, that anyone who is trans in a piece of media usually is, like I said, a prostitute on the street that gets killed by a bad man with a knife, or that their bodies are being punished for transitioning. There's a movie with I cannot remember her name, but she was in Fast and Furious. That was a serial killer or a hitman gets turned into a trans woman as a punishment by an evil doctor, and he goes to try and get revenge on her for punishing him for turning him non-consensually into a woman. And it's not a great look. It's not a very accurate portrayal of the trans experience. And because of this, there's these non-factual misleading accounts. I mean, we look at Brandon Tina experience in Boys Don't Cry and how it was portrayed on film by Hilary Swank. There's been a lot of interviews with the people who were involved with Brandon Tina before his death, and the movie romanticized a lot of the elements of the romance between Brandon Tina and his then girlfriend, which was not what actually happened in real life. And obviously Hollywood dramatizes a lot of these things. But again, this is one of the most famous films made about a transgender person. It's not accurate. It's the same with the Danish Girl does the same thing. The information about what happened to the main character in that film is not accurate to what happened in real life. And it's unfortunate because it presents these very misleading stereotypes and does not present an accurate picture. So a lot of this, when we're talking about the idea of victimhood and punishment, also goes into real life as well. One thing that's still legal in some contexts in Canada is what's known as the gay or transgender panic defense. So this is an idea that someone is exonerated from violence towards a transgender person because they felt tricked by this person in an encounter. And this doesn't have to be they even began a sexual encounter with each other. They just felt uncomfortable by someone being transgender near them, and they fell into hysterics. And because of this mental lapse, they committed murder or were violent towards someone, and they were exonerated from their crimes. As of 2022, 17 states have banned this defense tactic, but it is still considered in Canada under certain circumstances and in the US at large. But again, in Canada, gay and trans panic defense relies heavily on the criminal code's definition of provocation. So a wrongful act or insult that is such a nature as to be sufficient to deprive an ordinary person of the power of self-control. So it's very contextual, but again, still legal. It's not banned. And because of all of this misinformation, all of these films and ways people have experienced the transgender experience without actually being trans, it has created this new culture of specifically trying to remove the agency of trans people and create this sort of panic or alarm about what people are doing with their bodies. Within Vancouver alone, we have an individual who goes around with a sandwich board that says children cannot consent to puberty blockers, and put his big sign up that said that he supported J.K. Rowling because she doesn't like trans people. There's people like Matt Walsh who specifically spend all their time going and doing incredibly unethical things to try and convince people not to let people use pronouns or go on puberty blockers. He writes hate pieces and specifically targets innocent people all the time. There's, what happened with the Sogi protests, all of these things that have sort of coalesced from this culture of misinformation and misrepresentation. So, as I was saying before, there is fictional elements to a lot of these arguments that have become commonplace and common rhetoric within these circles. There's the ideas that, we're giving surgeries and hormones to 5-year-olds, which just isn't true. It doesn't happen. There's no evidence of this happening. And especially within the work that I've done, parental consent is a huge piece of working with youth. Parents have to be involved. It's not like someone just comes in off the street and we just give them a prescription and send them away. It takes months of work to get someone to the point where, they're ready to begin the transition process. And it's the same with BC Children's Hospital. Like, they have like an almost 2.5-year wait list. Like, it's not a simple process. It's not people just walking off the street. And there are guidelines that all these physicians follow as well. But again, once these sort of ideas perpetuate within these circles, they're not discussed in a way that really makes a huge difference. One of the other biggest pieces of misinformation is around surgery regret rate. The surgery regret rate. So between 2016 and 2021, there was a work group of over 50 multidisciplinary contributors, including plastic surgeons, endocrinologists, psychologists, and other reproductive healthcare specialists, conducting a study to see the regret rate of gender-affirming surgery versus other elective cisgender surgeries. So about 0.3% of the people in this study regretted their gender-affirming surgery. And again, a lot of these statistics are surgery regret from issues that arose with post-op care complications. It's not the surgery itself. There's lots that can go wrong if you do not follow the instructions of your surgeon, or you get it in a place where you're not going to have sufficient post-op care available to you. Again, why a lot of surgeons will not proceed through with the surgery unless they have all of those ducks in a row. So when we're seeing this as well, we're seeing almost 18% for people who went through knee replacement surgery that regretted it. And then just here at the end, 78% of people regret getting at least one of their tattoos. So, this is from a different study, but I just thought it was pretty funny to see that, between gender-affirming surgery and getting a bad tattoo, the statistics of not liking your good or your bad tattoo are considerably higher. So, I mean, a question a lot of people have is like, well, if all this information exists and is available for people to look into, why is there so much misinformation going around? And one of the reasons is there is a proponent for media bias between different news outlets. Every news outlet has its own specific agenda and bias that it tends towards, depending on who their audience is. I mean, the New York Times is not going to try and appeal to a market outside of the yuppies that read their market or read their paper. The CNN has a very specific audience that they're reaching out to. Fox News has a very specific audience they're reaching out to, and they'll tailor what they say based on that audience and what they know will get viewership or reactions. And we saw over the last 10 to 15 years, especially with the proponent of Facebook and Facebook articles, that there's been a lot less of this need for people to read the entire article. People will just cite tweets, or people will read the title of an article, which is usually less than 100 characters, and that's not enough for someone to make a convincing argument. So there's a lot of this idea of clickbaiting, and this falls into getting people on the side of misinformation because they're susceptible to this specific media bias and don't possess the media literacy skills to be able to make their own decisions. So with that being said, we could also define this as an unjust favoritism and reporting of a certain ideas or standpoints in the news, social media, and entertainment, such as movies or television. But we see media bias through the information that not only these forms of media report on, but also any sort of information that we have access to. But how does this affect transgender individuals? And so gender diverse people are often framed in a subjective or harmful manner by certain news sources and are reported on a way in which their community has no control over the messaging sent out to consumers via specific rhetoric or bias by labeling. One of the most famous examples of this is within, I was reading a book recently called The Transgender Issue. It's written by a transgender advocate in the UK named Sean Fay. And it has a section about a teacher who came out as trans before returning to school for the next year to teach. And she didn't mention it to anyone, was going to come out very naturally, but the school put it out in their school newsletter, and upset parents got very defensive about this being gender ideology that was going to affect their children, and it got its way to Pierce Morgan. Pierce Morgan created a media circus that eventually cost this woman her life. She was unable to leave her home. She was the subject of public ridicule by the UK press, and eventually it got to the point where she just couldn't take it anymore, and she is unfortunately no longer with us. But because of this, this is not a common occurrence, or this is not an uncommon occurrence. This happens all the time, especially with the rise of things like Kiwi Farms and QAnon and other internet hate groups that have specifically targeted trans women and trans men as a way to further their specific agendas. But these things, there are ways that we can combat this. There are ways that we, as educators and as allies, can continue this work in a productive way. So one of the ways to protect our gender diverse colleagues is by ensuring that we're using affirming language in our regular day-to-day vocabulary, and ensuring staff are aware of how their language impacts our colleagues. When ensuring that our employees' names and emails and staff identification have the names that they use versus their legal names, and then making sure that we're using terms like folks or everybody or team as opposed to guys, gals, men, ladies, and other gender-specific terminology. Again, I'm really bad for this. I use the term guys all the time. Hey, use guys. It's just a colloquialism that is almost near impossible to get out of our vocabulary, but making that effort is important, especially when we're trying to create a more inclusive atmosphere. And then we're looking at things like washroom accessibility, using universal inclusive signage or multi-stalled bathrooms, or having single-stalled washrooms that are specifically gender neutral. And a lot of spaces, especially within Vancouver Coastal Health, have adopted this practice. I can't say for UBC, I haven't been on the campus in a long time, but this is steps we can take to make sure that these spaces accommodate everyone. And then we can also, focus on specific behavioral concerns, not identity concerns within the washroom or change room. So, somebody coming in and turning all the taps on and doing a jig and pulling toilet paper down everywhere. Not great bathroom behavior. Obviously, we would not want that person to do that in the bathroom, but that's a behavioral concern as opposed to someone who just goes into the washroom, does their business, and leaves. In BC and in most of Canada, trans people have the legal right to access the washrooms or change rooms based on their gender identity, not their anatomy. So again, it's important to keep that in mind. And then with visuals, making sure that we have posters or pins or materials up in our spaces that show that we are creating an inclusive environment, and making sure that we're recognizing non-traditional families and 2S LGBTQIA+ partners and parents. A lot of us at VCH wear pronoun pins. It's another helpful way to show that you're an ally and to be more inclusive. So just to go a little more into inclusive language, avoiding assumptions is usually the best way to start a conversation with someone, especially when you're, in that position of power. So one of the ways is to start neutral, then mirror. So not assuming someone's gender identity, pronouns, or sexual orientation when you're first speaking to them, starting with neutral terms like referring to them as they, or, if you're talking about someone's spouse, saying partner or spouse, as opposed to wife or husband, not using sir or ma'am. I don't know if that would necessarily be really relevant within education, but it definitely is within healthcare settings. But people will correct you as necessary. And once you do that, you just mirror those terms. And in creating inclusive language, there are tons of words we can change to remove gender out of them. Here are some more. Then I mean, I use most of these already anyways. I think I did it even before I did this education work. It's just some of them come more naturally. But especially with partner, I feel like partners become a very common use case for almost everything. I have a lot of friends who, are married or are in common law marriages, and they don't use the term wife or husband. They just use partner. Didn't go to a church for it, so I don't know, just got into the habit of using it anyways. Another one that's obviously had a lot of time in the sun recently, for better or for worse, is the use of they, them, theirs pronouns. So the best part about these pronouns is that we already all use them all the time. It's not a new thing to use them for someone in the singular. We use these pronouns quite frequently for people or objects that we don't know the gender of. So it's just easier to just apply that. And then some people use they, them pronouns, some don't. It's really dependent on the person. So what happens if you accidentally use the wrong name, pronoun, or word? I think the best way to go about this in a lot of ways is to just apologize briefly, correct your language. So whether that means using a different word, term, name, or pronoun, and then move on. Often we can feel this, compulsion to try and, show that we are allies. And in a lot of ways that can be quite detrimental to, repairing a relationship when we've made a mistake like this. Again, if you have relatives in your family who are trans or queer, it may not be necessary to mention that when you're apologizing. It's just easier to keep it brief. There are things to avoid, obviously, as well, one of which being dead naming or misgendering, especially if you're taking role and that has people's dead names on it. That can be a tricky one. So I don't know what UBC's policies are for letting people use their preferred names on roll sheets for attendance. Hopefully good. If not, that's something that could definitely be looked at by the administrative staff. It's the same with misgendering too. It's it's a word with a lot of connotation, especially, within the way we talk about gender right now. But it does negatively affect the mental and physical health of trans individuals. And it creates a lot of fear and anxiety and mental exhaustion from having that experience over and over and over again, and feeling like you're not being heard or you're not being recognized, or people aren't making the effort to see you as you are. So a lot of these can also be considered what we would call microaggressions. So these are statements or actions that are indirect or subtle or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. So whether or not you respect someone's pronouns, saying something like, I don't do pronouns, I think they're stupid, is like not, it's kind of, it's still a bit reductive. It's not a great look. But again, it really depends on the situation. There are a lot of things people could say in a positive way that could be interpreted as like a microaggression. Like if you saw someone who was a trans woman and you came up and you're like, oh, you have such big hands, that might not come off as you might have not have meant it as an insult, but it could come off as like specifically saying something that could make someone uncomfortable. So in a lot of ways, it's just best not to talk about people's bodies. But if you do deal with a situation where you have, transphobic comments that may be said within staff or colleagues or within students, it's important to address these comments at appropriate times. Unless they are being disruptive in the moment, it can often be beneficial to just avoid singling a person out and speaking with them privately to help avoid someone getting defensive. If you're concerned about inappropriate or discriminatory comments around the workplace, speaking to a supervisor or speaking to HR or manager is important, just to figure out the right way to move forward with it. And then if one person is the target of another colleague's actions or comments, check in with them before approaching the commenter. So on top of that, ensuring that your language towards the commenter is appropriate to your workplace as well. So that being said, there is another portion to this, and this is something I don't see talked about quite often, but I feel is an important issue to address, which is the idea of allyship versus performativity. So we all want to be good people. We all have good intentions, but a lot of times the way we do things can come off as seeming that we are doing it for praise and appreciation from other people. So one of those things is the idea of allyship versus performativity. So when discussing allyship, the term optics obviously comes into the conversation quite a bit. And these are words or actions that are viewed by others and judged on their authenticity. So in some ways, you might post on social media about supporting trans rights, but this can just come off as pretty hollow in a lot of ways, and instead it may be better to just join a discussion on legislature changes and become involved in panels that advocate for changes at a systemic level, or talking to your coworkers about trans issues and the news that you notice might be an important thing to do, but it's important to make sure that we are also creating a dialogue at the workplace that helps improve the conditions for our gender diverse colleagues and for our students. And then, talking about how supportive you are of your trans colleague or relative to them when they aren't there can also, especially if they're not out to everyone, can be, quite damaging. So it's important to be supportive in meaningful ways. We shouldn't need a pat on the back from other people to be supportive. So it's important that we endeavor to change and make changes that matter and last. Just to cap that, I don't have anything on it, but I think it's important to mention a lot of this discussion came out of the corporatization of pride. If you have seen, a lot of groups that wouldn't normally be involved with Pride have become become involved with Pride in the last decade. Banks, large scale businesses, and a lot of what they do is they'll put Pride decorations up in July or June, and that's that. They're just like, here we go, we like gay people, okay, back to business. And it just becomes sort of like Hallmark pageantry. So again, that's where this idea of like performativity has really invaded actual good allyship that is being done by folks that is genuine and intentional. But on the last piece of that as well, we have to ensure that we are employing confidentiality. If someone who's a colleague or a student isn't out, it's really important that we have explicit permission before sharing information about someone's gender identity or their sexual orientation to colleagues or others. That being said, if someone's constantly misgendering them, I find it, instead of just correcting them, unless you've talked to this person about it before, it's often best to talk to that person who's been misgendered when they're not there and ask them if it's okay if you correct people. Because again, it's, if they're not out, it could be potentially a situation that creates a lot of tension and anxiety at their work from them not having control out of people knowing that they're out. So it's and then not only that, it compromises people's comfort and safety. We don't know how everyone feels about trans people, and we don't want to potentially create a situation that can get out of control quite quickly. And the idea, there are also questions that should just be avoided because they are invasive. Trans people and gender diverse people often get asked pretty inappropriate and invasive questions about their bodies, about medications and surgeries from people who, for the most part, are genuinely well-intentioned. It's not a question you would ask someone. We have to make sure that we're keeping questions relevant to the topic of the appointment or visit or the class, or the one-on-one. But again, it's really, these questions, this idea of relevance is the key piece of it, and making sure that if we do have questions, that we're asking them privately or respectfully if we feel they are really important to ask. And we talked a lot earlier about washrooms and change room access, but again, washrooms don't need to be gendered, especially if they're single stall washrooms. They're just doesn't help anybody. Most of the time they're handicap accessible washrooms anyways, so they're not wheelchair accessible washrooms. Like they don't need to be gendered. It serves no purpose. That being said, if you do want to learn more about what is available or what is covered under the rights of transgender people in BC, there's this link right here about public spaces and services. And then finally, we talked a bit about visuals, but wearing pins, having posters up, having stickers. It's an important way to show and signal, more than to be like, hey, look at me, aren't I great because I have a poster of two men kissing in my back? I'm really cool with gay people. That's not helpful, right? But it is also important to, if you have like a rainbow flag up or a trans flag up or pins on your lanyard, to signal to people that you're a safe person to talk to. So that's the importance of visuals versus the idea of optics. So with that, give yourself a pat on the back.